Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled Balnea, Vina, Venus, an exploration of Roman daily life. And I'm very pleased that Matthew Pansierra from Gustavus Adolphus College in St. Peter, Minnesota is able to join us as the lead scholar. My name is Andy Mink, and I'm the Vice President for Education Programs at the National Humanities Center. I'm super pleased that all of you could join us tonight. In daylight savings, it feels a little different to do these webinars with it still being light outside. And I do understand that this is work after work for all of you. And so we always appreciate that you have the dedication and the interest in the humanities to spend this 90 minutes with us and to learn more about these compelling topics. I do need to thank my colleagues, Libby Taylor and Mike Williams, for all of their hard work in the education department. Libby, as most of you know, is your primary contact for all things National Humanities Center. You get the constant contact email address, email from her. She coordinates the webinars both with you and with our lead scholars, and she's really under the hood in all the work that we do. And I also want to thank Mike Williams as the Education Project Manager for really taking care of the complex matrix that is this national outreach work that we do. I've included our Twitter handles and Libby's email address as an invitation to please reach out to us if you ever have any questions or feedback or thoughts. That includes anything that you'd like to see us do that we haven't. It also includes any kind of certification or any kind of documentation we can provide if that'd be helpful for you as you support your own teaching growth and portfolio. The webinar tonight is an audio-only webinar. It will be guided by a PowerPoint that has been created by our lead scholar, but it does depend on your participation. So down in the bottom of the Go to Training control panel, you'll see a chat option, and in that chat option, you can communicate with the room. I've seen many of you already introduce yourself, and I do appreciate that. A lot of familiar names. Also nice to see folks from all around the country. It's also a place you can ask questions of our scholar. It's a place that you can share resources and thoughts with each other, and it's a place that you can start to pull together your own thoughts if we pose open-ended questions to you. So I would encourage you to use that chat box, and I do try to save them each night, and we'll try to include those in the follow-up resources so you can see some of the conversation that happens during this session. National Humanities Center is actually, it's funny, I just talked about the chat box and I see Stephanie Corbin noting that she's having some audio issues. She, of course, won't hear me say this, but I will note that if you ever can't hear, it's almost always on your end and it may be some kind of connection. I would encourage you to either, this is going to sound like I'm being smart, I don't mean to, make sure the volume is up first. You might also check to make sure that the audio input is coming from the right place, and if all else fails, sign out and come back in, and that must always kickstart you. So I wish I could offer more savvy feedback than that, but generally speaking, it's just a log in, log out issue. So I hope Stephanie pulls that together. The National Humanities Center is located in Durham, North Carolina. This is about this is our 41st year that we have supported humanities scholarship. Every year we accept a fellowship of university professionals and professors in the humanities who come to the center and do their work. They do their research and their writing and generally advance our understanding of the world through the humanities. Our education work then is intended to build bridges between that scholarly world and the world of the classroom. So while a majority of the educators we work with are K-12 level, we also work with community college and college educators, and we offer this content, this scholarship, this understanding as a critical piece to instruction and to classroom climate and culture. In many cases, we can provide you with free and open resources that create this bridge. We have classroom-ready lessons and primary source collections. We also have a set of essays written by scholars that help unpack difficult topics. I will say at this point that many of our lessons tend to focus on history and literature, but we're working hard to change that. And I think you'll find in the coming 6, 8, 12 months that this repository will grow considerably. It will go across disciplines and ultimately offer you a chance to level that for the age, the grade, and the ability level that you are working with. Our webinar series is also a really important way for us to introduce scholars to teachers and vice versa. I'm pleased that I think this is our 18th webinar this year, and we've reached capacity at 200. We've We've sold out. We filled the room for almost all of them. I did add a new webinar this year. On May 16th, we will be offering a webinar on the ethics of gerrymandering, a very relevant and important topic now that we're entering the election cycle yet again. And from a North Carolina perspective, something that really does affect our daily life. So we'll be working on gerrymandering on May 16th. The registration for that is open, and I would encourage you to hustle and sign up for that if you're interested, because I know the numbers are already approaching that, that cap that we have at 200. All of our webinars are recorded. They are then put on our YouTube channel afterwards, and you can view these, you can slow them down, you can pause, you can match them with the PowerPoint, maybe linger on some topics and conversations that either went too quickly or just really meaty, deep conversations, and I would encourage you to go and check that out as well. We also have other digital content that we have available for free open access. That includes a series of podcasts. This particular podcast between Michael Fontaine, who's at Cornell, and Sky Shirley, who's in Boston, a teacher in Boston, is a conversation between educator and scholar on the best practices, the best ways to approach the classics and to bring those to life in the classroom. We also have a series of online courses, and I am optimistic and very confident that we'll have these 10 titles available for 5-week modules starting in August. And I would encourage you to keep an eye on that through the spring and summer for signups for those courses. All this work is informed by the Teachers Advisory Council that serves a 1-year term for the center. We ask them to evaluate and to give feedback on much of our curriculum development. We also ask them to serve as consultants and to present on our behalf and generally spread the word about the National Humanities Center. I'm very, very pleased and grateful to all of them for the work they do, including Michelle Kane and Sky Shirley, who just typed into the chat box. We will be opening applications for next year's council. That's a term of roughly August 31st to July of the following year. We will start accepting applications for next year's cohort in April with a due date, I think, in early May. So if you attend our sessions, if you're comfortable with our work, you'd like to contribute to it, I would love to have you send in your application. When you go to register for our webinars, you likely have seen this prior approval form. Now that we're getting close to the end, at least in the fourth quarter of our webinar series, I'd encourage you to go and download that and bundle all of the events and the activities that you've done with us together for one cumulative submission to your administration. I think it'll not only help you streamline the process, but it will also help you identify different ways in which these online activities can support your own growth. And I know that every district and every state and every place has its own vocabulary and own expectations, and we're happy to tailor make or to address specific things that you might have. So just let us know if those questions arise. At the end of tonight's session, when I close the room, you will be greeted with a survey, and that survey will then allow you to complete a, I'm sorry, I was reading the comments and I totally lost my train of thought. This survey, when you complete it, will allow you to download your certificate. And again, that's something you can submit for continuing ed credit. So that's my my introduction to the center. As always, I am very happy that you've joined us, and I'm super happy that Matt Pensiera has joined us from Minnesota. And Matt, if you give me a moment, I'm going to unmute you and welcome you to join us. Matt is the Associate Professor of Classics at Gustavus Adolphus College. Again, that's in St. Peter, Minnesota. And I have provided Matt's email address if you'd like to follow up with him. But I think one of the reasons that I was attracted and invited Matt to do this, and in fact, Matt, you may not know that Mike Fontaine at Cornell recommended, gave me your name, but I was really interested in someone who spends a lot of your thinking, your professional life, balancing that line between research and scholarship and teaching. And my guess is, while I've greeted all these teachers in the same way, my guess is you stand in front of kids quite a bit and try to convince them that the classics are important. Is that a difficult thing to do?
No, I mean, I think, or I hope that what you'll experience tonight, you'll see the inherent interest. I mean, I think students are drawn, especially to this topic of daily life, in part because it seems familiar at first, and then it seems so strange that they are kind of more deeply and further intrigued. And so No, I think if I can get them to come to class, spend just an hour looking at some of the evidence that you'll see tonight, I've got them. I've got them.
Yeah, I think it's a really nice way to say it. And there is that sort of aha moment where the past and the present sort of collide, and I suspect that happens a lot more often than us non-classicists realize.
Sure.
Uh, do you find that when students enter your class, they have a pretty strong mental model for the way they're going to approach this subject and topics,
No, they have
or
no idea whatsoever.
they
Uh,
just have no idea? That's really fantastic.
I mean, I think there's this huge sort of growth of an historical imagination when they run into the Romans, because they think that they know them, or that they think they're maybe a little bit aware of them. But when they see them up close, and I mean, I felt this myself when I first started studying them, especially looking at the graffiti. It felt to me like I was peering through a window, and seeing them live out their lives in Pompeii, and that was just so incredibly exciting. And so I think an historical imagination really springs forth when students look at the ancient world, in part because they don't bring any, there are no sort of political preconceptions that they bring to it. So
Absolutely, and it strikes me that those are the kinds of that historical imagination then can be applied to a whole variety of things in the contemporary world.
yeah, I think it's vital. I think it's absolutely central.
Great. Well, thank you again, Matt, for being here. I've given you the mouse to the PowerPoint, and I'm anxious to hear your talk tonight. Again, I'm going to be monitoring the chat box, and I'll bring questions in when it seems appropriate.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Oh, I didn't want to go there already. Um, well, thank you for inviting me to do this webinar, and thank you to all of you who signed up, especially those of you who are teachers. I guess you're all teachers. I've just had the best experience recently teaching about Roman daily life to pre-collegiate teachers, and you've really given sort of new purpose to my career. So I'm glad that you took the time to participate in the webinar tonight. I wanted to actually start with uh, uh, the inspiration for the title of this webinar, which is Balnea, Vina, Roman daily life is so big as a topic. It takes in so much, and there's so many pieces of evidence that that kind of fall under that area of study, that I knew I needed to kind of narrow that down for our discussion today. And I really took my inspiration for that from this epitaph, which I hope is the next slide. Now, how do I move the slide? I'm not seeing the, oh, there I go.
Try one more.
There it is. So this epitaph is just fantastic. It says, he lived 52 years. To the spirits of Tiberius Claudius Secundus, here he has everything with him. Bathing, wine, and sex ruin our bodies. But bathing, wine, and sex make life worth living. And so I decided that those three would really be the topics of my talk on the impossibly larger topic of Roman daily life, because these are central, as the writer of this epitaph made clear. They are absolutely essential for life. Yes, they sometimes ruin our bodies, but they are critical and key to both our kind of physical well-being, but also to the basic and essential pleasures of life. In fact, the Balnea, Vina, shows up in 5 other inscriptions, not quite saying the same thing as we see in this epitaph, but I've always loved it because I think it says something essential about the Romans. In terms of our discussion tonight, I've never led a webinar, but I want this to focus on whatever aspects you all find most interesting. Given the format, though, I did need to set it up as a PowerPoint, kind of with a visual reference highlighting some of the sources and questions that I included in the pre-webinar packet. I also have included some visual evidence in the PowerPoint to supplement that. But if you want to ask about or comment on any of the source material in the PDF that I provided, it'd probably be a help to refer at least to the page number of that PDF. Galen page 11, for example, and I'll be able to kind of locate it and understand. So it's my plan that I'll take things in order. We'll start with baths. We'll move from the baths and bathing practice. We'll move to food and dining, and we'll finally conclude with sex and physical passion. We'll probably spend more time on the first two topics. We will get to the last topic, but at least when I've worked with teachers in the past, that was, depending on their teaching situation, somewhat less useful to them. But still, it's an essential aspect of life. We shouldn't avoid it, and we aim to get to all three of the main topics tonight. So if we move here, we have some questions that I posed in this PowerPoint and actually on the original PDF. And we're starting with bathing, and so basic question of what was the bathing experience like, what activities seemed important to the bathers, and from your reading of these sources, was there anything that kind of surprised you about being there or not being there in the Roman description of the bathing practice? I start here. We can perhaps look at, and I can talk a little bit about this first source, which is fantastic. Actually, it's kind of a language learning source that I didn't know about until fairly recently. And we see them talking about, at the very beginning, it's not clear who's talking. It's probably a father speaking with a son, and also perhaps there are some slaves there as well. And he starts off by saying, well, take the towels down to the bath, the strigil, the face cloth, the foot cloth, the flask of oil, the soap. Now go on ahead of us, and get a place for us. Somebody responds here, probably the slaves. Where do you want that to be? Do you want to go to the public baths or the private ones? Now they finally make it there, and then he says, well, take off your clothes, probably talking to his son perhaps. And then somebody else responds, take off my shoes, put the clothes together, cover them, wash them well. Now don't doze off on account of the thieves. And then they get to the topic of playing ball, perhaps wrestling, and ultimately they're talking about also going into the tepidarium, the warm room, and maybe even a hot pool. Ultimately maybe finishing up by jumping into the open air pool, the cold pool. This source then kind of finishes up with talking about getting some food towards the end of the bathing practice. But I thought it's really fascinating, first of all, how much stuff you have to bring with you. A towel, a strigil, which would be for kind of scraping the oil and the dirt off of your body after you had oiled up and perhaps even exercised. I love the differentiation between a face and a foot cloth, and then even soap. We don't often hear people mention specifically soap, but he's talking about soap there. There are different kinds of baths. Now the baths often were, in the Roman world, were public, paid for by the emperor in particular, or by sort of wealthy inhabitants of your town. That would make it affordable, but there were plenty of private baths. And they tended to be, I think we see another source talk about a price of, 1 penny, 1 ass. And so that's not a lot. I also love how this source dwells on when you take off your clothes and you leave them to kind of enter into the bath. The real problem is not your nakedness, but it's theft. And we see that come back again and again in terms of some of the source material about the baths. There's plenty of physical exercise, ball games and wrestling, swimming even. Although probably, if we're thinking about swimming, the baths, at least the swimming areas that I've seen in most Roman baths are roughly 4.5 or 5 feet, probably would have been about 5 feet deep. So you could swim in that, but it wasn't quite the same as sort of an Olympic depth pool. We also see here mentioned in this first source, and if you go on and look at the Seneca letter here that continues, we see one of the key features that I'll come back to of a Roman bath, which is the heated space. So heated space, heated water, that was absolutely central to the Roman bathing experience. That's what captured you when you finally had a Roman bath in your town. In Seneca's letter, he mentions many of the same things that we see in the first source, but I love some of the new details that emerge. For example, about massage and depilation. You can have your hair plucked. There's a little bit more about all the various kinds of sort of foods that you can get there. Again, there's some dangers of theft. But he also talks about the kind of games that end up getting played there. And in fact, we even have in some of the Roman baths, we have sort of game boards etched into various surfaces. So people were sort of playing board games there. And all of that got me thinking as I was working on this material today. Is there really a sort of a modern equivalent to the role that the bath, some of the things that we've seen here in these opening sources, to the role that the bath played in ancient daily life? Any thoughts about what this? I mean, we don't have a single place that really would serve all these roles, but what would start to kind of be the equivalent of the ancient bath? Any thoughts?
That's a great question, Matt, and I'm going to give you a chance to swallow some water, but also invite all of our participants to type into the chat box in response to that question. It's in red on the screen. Already, Andrea Harris has set a fancy gym, and I know Ginger Park, former TAC member, offers it's a little bit like a 24-hour fitness. So it does have that kind of day spa, as Stephanie said. Day at the beach, says Michelle, Jersey Beach maybe. Brittany, I'm not quite sure what Jim Joe Bangs is, but maybe so. Maybe a bar or a saloon.
Recreation center.
Yeah, recreation center.
Yeah, all these. I had sort of restaurant / bar, a Turkish bath. Sure. I wish it was more of a presence in our own culture. Full service gym. I thought that's excellent. Beauty parlor, a spa perhaps was a better term for it.
And as Adam asks there, Matt, Adam asks, what was the interaction between rich and poor in the baths? Were they segregated in any way?
That is an excellent question. I'll be talking more about it, but just to give you kind of the heads up on this, yeah, I think it was both a democratic space and a not very democratic space all at once. So in other words, almost everyone went to the bath, to the public bath, even if you had a huge, fantastic, wonderful house and you had even installed kind of a small private bath within that house. You did tend to go out to your public establishment because you wanted to be seen. And you wanted to basically put on a social performance at the public baths. Now, the public baths were cheap enough such that everyone could go. But once you got there, there was a way in which the wealthy and the rich were sort of putting on a social performance of their status, of their privilege. And they were kind of accentuating that and emphasizing that.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And Brittany Baker, by the way, thank you for educating me on the Jimji Bang. That's something I hadn't heard of. That sounds like a Los Angeles thing. Fantastic. Matt, tell us some about the sources that you have drawn from here. Are these, well-researched sources? Are they easy to find? How did you pull these together?
Yeah, they are. So there are probably, and towards the end, maybe, or maybe even in follow-up, I can give you a list of the sort of the 5 or 6 best books that are basically a collection of sources on daily life, Roman daily life. So these are some of the most important and informative of sources drawn from those books.
Yeah.
So many of these are fairly well known. Now I will be getting to some that are somewhat lesser well known, especially within the graffiti of Pompeii. That might be a case that that people won't have known or heard about some of that material.
Thank you. Jocelyn asks, what about women? Do they have their own baths?
Yeah, can I move forward and I can kind of show you some of the evidence for that?
Please do.
Okay. So here we have, and some of you might recognize this, here we have a plan of the Stabian baths in Pompeii. And what's fascinating about these baths, they're fairly early baths, and fairly early in the history of Roman baths anyway. And what you can see here, I don't know if you can see my pointer on the screen, but up here there's a narrow little entrance up by number 5, which actually had the word women written over it. And women went down this long hall here, and then they came to a portion of the bath space that was separate from the rest of the bath. So their heated portion of the bath was in numbers 2, 3, and 4. Whereas the men and any men using the bath actually used sort of the larger rooms, larger to a certain extent, but still in these Roman numerals 6, 7, and 8 here. And the furnace was located right between them. And we see actually Roman sources talking about how you should probably try to plan your bath such that the furnace will heat both the women's section and the men's section. Now, what's interesting is that in this early bath from Pompeii, the Stabian baths, they separated the space out. But it seems that certainly we have plenty of evidence of baths that did not have separate facilities. And we hear from some sources that sometimes women were allowed to go to the bath in earlier hours and men used the baths at later hours. But then we have sources like some of the Marshall poems that were in your PDF, where it's clear that men and women are kind of sharing the space at the same time, nude in the same pools, so in the same hot tubs, in effect. And that perhaps is I know it's always a surprise to my students when they hear that, but that seems to have been true certainly once you got down to the time of the empire. Just to talk a little bit more about this space in the Stabian baths, you walk in through the main entrance for men, at least, is through A here, and then you have kind of this large open space in C, which is the palaestra. So that's the place where you'd have people exercising, where you'd have people playing sort of ball games. You'd have people sort of walking around on display, in effect. You had kind of a covered portico here through B. And ultimately, you could jump into the cold pool F here. There were some rooms on either side of it. We don't exactly know where what would have happened in those rooms. They were probably multi-purpose in some ways, but really the core of a Roman bath was its heated space. And so here is the heated space in Roman numerals 6, 7, and 8, and as I was saying, the numbers 2, 3, and 4 up above for the women. And so those were the rooms where, well, actually 6 was where you took off your clothes, 7 was the tepidarium, and 8, closest to the furnace, was the caldarium, with sort of a heated pool, sort of hot tub sized for several people to be able to get in, and then sort of a round basin that you could splash yourself with cold water. It seems the Romans liked that kind of interchange between cold and hot, which actually anyone who knows sort of modern spas and modern bathing practices sometimes does the same thing. Back here, Roman numeral 5 was probably a sweat room, or sort of the equivalent of a sauna. And at some point, after having enjoyed this heated space, you could come back out and probably jump in the cold pool. And it's not clear to us necessarily that there was a fixed practice of what you did first and what you did second, but certainly this heated space, which required a lot of wood and kind of very, very purposeful construction, and it also required a good influx, a regular influx of water, because you needed to change out the water in these pools. That was a critical or a key element of the Roman bathing practice. And that really meant that Roman infrastructure totally drove this practice, this opportunity to kind of have baths in your life, because you needed an aqueduct, you needed the Roman engineering to be able to access kind of all of the wonderful elements that come together in this bath.
We have a couple of questions that have queued up. If you don't mind, Matt, I'm going to do these in order, I think. So first of all, Ginger Park asks, how were these baths heated? Did they have running heated water through the pipes underneath?
Sure. They had not necessarily running water from underneath. So there was the floors were suspended. The floors were kind of raised up in the heated sections of the bath, and there were basically furnaces, simply hot fires that were stoked underneath that. That brought hot air kind of throughout the heated part of the building. But that also heated up basins of water, sort of metal basins of water that would then feed into the hot pool and the warm pool.
Thank you. Second question, this one is from Jennifer. She asks, how often did people visit the baths? Was it once a week or once a day?
It's an excellent question. It's a little bit hard for us to know any one person's sort of practice. I tend to think that once you had enjoyed the pleasures of a bath, you tended to go back fairly frequently, and at least the expense of it is so cheap that it seems that people would have been sort of drawn to do this almost on a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another question, and this one is from Stephanie. She asks, is there any evidence of people hogging certain spaces?
Yeah, I think that probably did happen. That you would have, some people would have been sitting in the hot tub, and it would have been hard to kind of move them along. And you see, even from this bath, and I think I've got a picture a little bit later on. Let me go a little bit further. Here are some of the changing rooms, or some of the little changing cubicles where you left your clothes. And you can see that then the theory was, at least, that you had a slave who would stand by your clothes in your cubicle, who would sort of guard those clothes. Of course, what did people do if they weren't wealthy enough to have a slave? That is an interesting question that we don't really know the answer to. Maybe those were the people who were tended to be thieved from more frequently. But let me just go a little further here. Here you can see some of the decoration, which is really, beautiful, really lovely in terms of how much they've put into it. Here we see some of those suspended sections of the bath where the furnace would operate below this area and bring kind of heated air all throughout the hot part of the bath. You can even see here, this is a wonderful picture from Ostia. You can see that the walls, which are sheathed in marble, have behind them sort of hollow sections that allow the hot air to rise up the walls and keep the entire room heated. And here you can see, when the question about how exactly they heated them, you can see at least this illustration of the furnace operating. It just simply sends then the hot air below the floor, but it also then directly heats these basins of water that then ultimately feed into the various pools. Here's a hot tub. So it wouldn't be very big. And yeah, I can imagine somebody sitting there and kind of not being moved along if they didn't want to be. And that's perhaps an aspect of the social dimension of the bathing experience. If you were there and you had a sort of a large and powerful enough posse with you, then probably you could kind of take control of certain areas of the bath as your own. And we hear of people actually kind of having favorite baths, and to a certain extent, in other words, they had enough, especially in Rome, that they could choose from one bath over another. And that was probably the case that, to a certain extent, you felt you occupied a certain niche in a certain bath, and counted on certain spaces. Here we see the the labrum, the basin that holds the cold water, in the hot room. And just to kind of pull you a little closer to this, you can see there would have been a little fountain of water that spouted from the center of that. And this basin, in fact, is so beautiful, piece of this marble. They've actually, the elected officials who oversaw the payment and construction of this basin actually put their names and inscribed how much it cost, 5,250 sesterces. They inscribed that in bronze on the edge of that basin. Here we're coming close, at least to the end of my slides on baths, and I just wanted to show you, I think, one of the most fantastic rooms in a bath that I know from the ancient Roman world. This is from actually a bath that was right along the sea in the town of Herculaneum. So we've moved up the coast just a little bit to Herculaneum. This is a bath structure, and if you look to the ground right in front of this building, this would have been where the Mediterranean Sea originally would have kind of come right up to the edge of this structure, this town, of this bath at the edge of Herculaneum. Within this building, let me show you this bath. This is a heated bath, or it's a very unusual bath because it's got these 3 steps down, probably would have made it 5 or 6 feet deep again, so not over the head, well, 5 feet deep, maybe not over the head of someone using it. But at the very center, there's this element, which is actually, if I zoom in on it, that is a heating element. This was a heated bath at the edge, a heated bath that you could submerge yourself in, so like a giant hot tub, I suppose, but really the size almost of one of those cold baths from back in Pompeii. This was a heated bath that used the furnace system to heat this water right at the edge of the sea. Absolutely fantastic, incredible sort of technological event. Now, one thing you did not want to do when you jumped into this pool was touch that that fixture, because it would have been super, super hot.
Matt, are most of these photographs yours?
No, I took most of them from Wikimedia Commons.
Okay, great.
I've seen most of these, or been to all these places, and have pictures of some of them, but I was looking for free pictures on the web. Other questions on baths or the bathing experience from these sources?
There's been some chat going on. By the way, Sky Shirley, who is in our chat, is our current member of the Teachers Advisory Council and a Latin teacher in Boston. And I've asked Sky to respond to many of the questions you might have. But one of the conversations that was ongoing there, and I maybe like your comment, Matt, is about sanitation. So how do you keep this this in a healthy, clean manner?
Yeah. So I don't know if you saw that. Those of you who might have seen the PDF beforehand, but there's a fantastic mention by Galen on, I think it's like page 11 of the source material. But Galen talks about this substance called gloios. And if you really want to discuss to your students, show them that, because gloios is basically the mucus that builds up on the wall of a bath from oil and sweat and just the humidity of the bath. Romans actually took that substance and made use of it medically. That can't have been good. I think there's no way in which I would have taken any medicine or made any use of a gloios-based medicine. But yeah, no, it's a huge question on how clean these baths would have been. I know that Mary Beard, in her book on Pompeii, insists that it would have been disgusting in a way that we couldn't stand, and I think that that's probably, there's a basis of truth to that. But remember that aqueducts, you really didn't have a big Roman bath unless you had an aqueduct directly feeding your town, and so that water constantly ran. And one of the first places it would go would be into the bath structure. And so it's my thought that we don't really know, but that they must have changed the water out, especially out of the hot pools, but also out of the cold pools. They must have made use of that water to change it up and keep it somewhat clean. But I think their tolerance for dirt, their tolerance for for lower levels of cleanliness than we would ever imagine, was much higher. So. Yes, that word is spelled gloios, exactly right.
Okay, it looks like those are the questions for bathing.
Sure. Let's move to food. Oh, this was just a bit. I have a lot of Marshall in here. Marshall is really useful for various aspects of Roman daily life, in particular the social elements. And so one of the things that I'm sure that you saw as you looked at the sources throughout this reading is that Marshall's often talking about sort of social hierarchy, social standing, and really trying to establish that he's better than all these other people that he's running into. And here you see him talking about this fellow Monogenes, angling for a dinner invite. We'll see Marshall doing this when we come to the sources on dining, and even then on the sources on sex. So this is sort of a running theme throughout this presentation on daily life. Okay, on to food. My questions were, what foods did you expect to see discussed in these sources, and what food surprised you? Was there anything missing from their diet that we have easy access to? What does it seem that the ancient Roman foodscape would have been like? And what impact would that have had on their daily life? And I started by just pulling out a couple recipes for some foods, one from Cato and this other from Apicius. And you can see that they're talking about both of these sources, talking about a lot of grains. So grain would have been at the basis of their diet. And this pottage, for example, that Apicius talks about, would have been had a sort of porridge consistency to it. And if you read through both these first two sources here, there's in addition to the grain, there's kind of a plainness to them. But there's also, I at least find that there's a sort of an odd combination of tastes. So you see, for example, in the Apicius recipe, that after you soak the emmer, which is a wheat, you add you kind of thicken it with some brains and with some other kinds of meat, and then you add pepper, herbs, fennel seed, and then that really pungent fish sauce known as garum. So I think that this one of the things that leaps out to me about Roman food, and if any of you have ever done, for example, a Roman banquet, perhaps with students, is that they tend to be kind of underwhelmed by the plainness of it, and then at the same time sort of grossed out by the combination of tastes, sort of the odd, sometimes mixture of spices, for example. And I think that these first two recipes bring that out for me a little bit. If we move on, one of the things that comes out in these sources from the next two sources that I have here, certainly fruits and vegetables would have been key to their daily diet. Now, fruits and vegetables only kind of in season, although it's interesting that in the Columella, they're actually, he's talking about sort of drying certain things such that people could have some of this fruit even during the winter season. But you see the vegetables mentioned in the Galen there: barley, beans, lentils, lots of legumes in their diet. So much more of that than meat for sort of middle class people, certainly lower class. though the Romans did love pork, and they would have, had some access to that. But most of the people in the Roman world, and you can even see towards the end of Galen's source, he's talking about people from the city basically coming and harvesting everything from the field, somehow taking it all, and the peasants were left with very little. And remember that for the Roman world, probably 80% of them lived in rural areas. They weren't living in cities. So they would have been much worse off in terms of their sort of food security. That would have been a pretty constant concern and a worry for people in the city, but then especially for people in the country. I mean, by the end of this source in Galen, they're talking about people in desperation eating grass. I mean, and that's the kind of thing that in the modern world we only hear of, in dictatorships in North Korea, for example. But that would have been the reality once in a while, certainly, for people in the Roman world. Questions, maybe, about people's impressions of some of these food sources so far?
You may have said this, but I want to make sure that Jocelyn has her question answered. An emmer is grain, correct?
Yeah,
Great.
it's a wheat. It's a wheat. So it would have made a porridge-like soup, I suppose.
Yeah.
Brains and grains, that's true. That the other aspect of this is, I think, would have been true in the Roman world, that they would have made it they would have made use of every last element of, certainly, of an animal in terms of eating it. They wouldn't have wasted much. So yeah, various organs and elements of an animal that we wouldn't consider edible, or that we would tend to shy away from, they probably had much less concern about. I could show you some of the pictures that we see here. Of course, one of the things that they would have, the other way that they would have taken a lot of their sort of daily calories in would have been through bread. And so bread was an incredibly popular and regular element of their diet. Here, I want to show you kind of certainly one of the most famous images of archaeological evidence from Pompeii. We actually have loaves of bread. That's a loaf of bread on the left, carbonized from the destruction of the city, but that loaf of bread was found within an oven. So we had bread that was actually baking at the time of the eruption of Vesuvius, and we've recovered it archaeologically. You can kind of even see the way that it's kind of cut into eights is probably what we're looking at here. There's been some debate for this painting on the right, but that we're probably looking at somebody selling loaves of bread, and that would have happened on a regular basis. On a daily basis, people would have gone to pick up their bread. We have about 35 bakeries or so in Pompeii for a town of 10,000. If we guesstimate that it was 10,000 people, so bread would have been a sort of a regular element of their diet. Now, there were different qualities of bread, which you probably saw from your sources. We saw bread that was kind of much more whole wheat, sort of a darker bread. We saw Romans also had kind of a whiter, softer, more expensive bread. And it was also true that because they ground the grain with millstones, you would often get little bits and pieces of a millstone into the flour. And your cheaper bread, perhaps they hadn't sifted it quite so carefully or gone through it quite so well. So we even have, from the skeletons found in Herculaneum, we have little pitted places in the teeth of some of those skeletons in Herculaneum, pitted spots that we think were created by the fact that people often ate bread that had little bits of stone and grain and grit in it. And so that kind of ground down their teeth. moving on from bread, lots of fresh fruit. We're certainly looking at grapes there. We might be looking at figs. And so one of the things that's really interesting, I find interesting about the Pompeians is that, and this would have been true in our own world until fairly recently, that they obviously would have been eating all their fruits and vegetables only in season. And I can remember that several years ago, I spent a year teaching in Catania in Sicily, and they had the most incredible fruit. But I can remember when I first got there in August, they had fresh figs, and fresh figs are just to die for. They're just heaven. And then 3 weeks later, they were gone, and I can remember my very sort of American disappointment that realizing that I wasn't going to get any more figs in Catania. They had no interest in importing figs all throughout the year. They lived on kind of a seasonal timeline, and that certainly would have been true of the Romans as well. Pomegranates, perhaps. Yeah, they would have had pomegranates as well. How would cheese be made? Oh, that's a wonderful question. Yeah, I had a participant last summer who was a cheesemaker. Last summer in my National Endowment for the Humanities summer seminar on Roman daily life, and he actually did his final project on the making of cheese. I can certainly share that with you, or ask him to share that with you, because they definitely made lots of cheese. What else do I have here? We see eggs and small birds would have been a wonderful source in their diet as well. And now I wanted to kind of transition perhaps a little bit to sort of food and dining, or dining, especially dining as a social event. Although you can see from the Petronius source there, and Petronius is one of my favorite sources for many aspects of Roman daily life. If I had to send you to one sort of ancient continuous reading that brought out the most colorful and interesting aspects of daily life, it would probably be Petronius, where he's got a central section of his novel called The Dinner of Trimalchio. So there's a lot in there about food, and you can see in this source here, he's talking about sort of ordinary things like olives, certainly, but then also sort of more exotic things at their dinner, such as dormice, which students are fascinated to find out that they would have both raised, basically farmed, a small rodent for their dinner table, but then sausages. But he makes it in this excerpt here that I have here. Trimalchio, the host of the dinner, is making it into almost a theater event. And so he's got hot sausages laid out on a silver grill, and then to make it look like coals underneath them, he's put sort of plums and pomegranate seeds to make it look like there's a live fire keeping those sausages warm. One of the things that's fun here, or that's clear to us here, and Cicero kind of lays this out, is that dining was really a social event. It was an aspect of daily life, but for the elite, it was also sort of a social performance. And so that's kind of what I wanted to transition to now, or show you, and talk about that a little bit. And here, in a sort of a wealthy Roman or Pompeian house, they would have had, the dining room was called a triclinium, and it was called a triclinium because they had the 3 dining couches, right? And these look very hard and not very comfy, but you would have reclined on these, resting on your left arm, sort of propped up on your left elbow, which freed up your right hand to be able to sort of reach for food and drink at the table, known as the mensa, standing at the center there. And so these dinners would have been probably involved perhaps 9 people. If the couches were big enough to fit 4 people per couch, maybe 12 people. would have been present at a sort of a Roman evening dining event. And you would have reclined there and talked with each other, and various courses of dinner would have been brought out on the mensa and then cleared away, and then more would have been brought out, and it would have been hours of your time spent in the evening in the pleasures of sort of Roman dining. Now, this was for the upper classes. For people who were poorer or even middle class, you would have tended to not have a reclining dining event like this, but perhaps you would have eaten at a bar quite frequently. So you would have eaten out. You didn't necessarily have a kitchen in your home where you cooked your dinner, but you could have kind of gotten dinner out at a bar locally. I've seen one scholar say that the Romans must have had incredibly strong sort of left arms and sort of left chest pectoral muscles, because it would have been incredibly uncomfortable. And it's not easy to eat that way, and it's not even very easy to converse that way. But in some ways, kind of like the toga, actually, the inconvenience of it at the same time sort of bestows a prestige. And there's a way in which you have to kind of learn, you have to kind of be trained up in this sort of leisure activity. And you have to learn how to do it well, both as a host, but also as a guest. Are there questions? Things I should respond to?
I'm sorry, Matt. Do you feel like you responded to Brennan pretty clearly about food preservation and storage?
Oh, I didn't. Let me go look at that.
Sure.
Yeah, food preservation and storage would have been an issue that they constantly dealt with. That was a challenge for them. One of the reasons that salt was so valuable to them was that it could preserve lots of things. But they had no place for kind of cold storage, although you could sometimes put things, I think maybe Sky is talking about things underground. You could have dolia, and you could kind of store things subterraneously such that they would last a little bit longer. We even hear of people at dinners having sort of snow, being able to chill their wine, or have desserts that somehow featured snow. Again, with salt, you could kind of perhaps have a cold box that kept snow cold for a little while, but it would be tough in the summer, which obviously then made it all the more necessary to sort of eat seasonally.
Jocelyn asks, was the reclining only for formal dinners? Did Romans eat sitting up for tenicum and pratium?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I suspect, Jocelyn, that you're exactly right, or what you're thinking here is that reclining tended to be for formal dinners, and that often you ate on the go, or you ate kind of more quickly, or certainly less formally. Breakfast and lunch we don't really hear of people inviting friends over in the same way that we hear for dinner. So I suspect that people, just sat down and ate. I didn't include them anywhere in my PowerPoint, but we do have sort of visual evidence, especially within the bars, of people simply sitting there and drinking a drink on a chair. So they didn't have to try to drink their beer while reclining, for example, unlike these people who, again, are practicing sort of fancy dining. Notice the woman sits. And so there are perhaps in some ways different rules for how women participated. They participated in dinners, but they perhaps didn't always sort of recline in the same way that the men did. Yeah, Sky is exactly right. Reclining is really middle and upper class. And even there, I don't think we should imagine necessarily that people are hosting big dinners every single evening. Again, it's social performance, and you don't necessarily do it every single night. Here you can see some people starting in the course of a dinner. You see this probably a slave-like character here in the center taking off this fellow's shoes, who's going to be reclining. Eventually, you see this guy very early in the dinner seems to be getting sick and perhaps throwing up, which doesn't bode well for him for the rest of the dinner. But you can see these people gathered around here. So I kind of coming to a close a little bit, not coming closer to the end here, talking about kind of the dining experience and what values about Roman society are revealed by their dining customs. It's really interesting in this letter by Pliny. He seems to be, he's presenting two very different kinds of dining experience. He's saying to a friend, why didn't you come to my house? I had actually a fairly modest little meal. But you went for kind of a much fancier dinner. But we would have had good entertainment, a comic play, a reader or a singer. But instead, you wanted, fancy dinner, oysters or sea urchins and Spanish dancing girls. So there's, again, Romans are playing with kind of these expectations of what is cultured and what is right and what is proper. And wealthy people threw extravagant dinners quite often. But they sometimes differentiated themselves from a dinner like Trimalchio's dinner in the Satyricon, which was just over the top wealthy. Oh, a good question from Jennifer about would they have eaten so much that they threw up and then started over? Is that correct? I'm pretty sure that we have little or no evidence that they did that. Now, they might have gotten sick just in the course of eating too much rich food and drinking, but not as kind of a regular practice of that was part of their experience, their dining experience. One of the things I just wanted to mention here, we come to kind of a close on dining, is that some of your best paintings from Pompeii come from the dining rooms. And some of those paintings, here we can see two paintings from the House of the Vetii, two mythological paintings. Some of you have probably seen these. On the left, we see Daedalus talking to Pasiphae. She has fallen in love with a bull, and he has constructed a wooden cow that she will climb into so that she can consummate her love for the bull. We see here on the right the destruction of Pentheus at the hands of his mother and other women in the town of Thebes. These were both paintings within the House of the Vetii in the dining rooms, and they were meant to sort of spark conversation. So you were supposed to participate in sort of intelligent and cultured back and forth with your fellow diners. Here's the last bit of food source that I wanted to show you. And I'll show it to you fairly quickly, but it's one of my favorites and probably not something that you've ever seen before. It's a list that comes from an inn. And it comes from a room within an inn. And he seems to be listing the food that he's had on particular days, or he or she's had, and then a price. And they're sort of listing kind of how much they spent day to day. And what's interesting is that most of the days are bread and oil and some wine. You might toss in some cheese. Bread for the slave is probably just a cheaper kind of bread. But then you come to a day that's 3 days before the Ides. Look at what happens there. He has a blowout party. He's got dried nuts and fruit. He's got bread. He's got beef. So he's got some meat finally that shows up on this day. He's got sausages. It's interesting that he lists female. And what this might be a reference to is a prostitute. So in other words, I think that that what's happening here is he's trying to keep track of basically the charges of what he's going to be charged at the end of his stay. And one of the services that was provided to him by the owner of the inn was a prostitute, probably a slave who worked for that person within the inn. But then all the other food kind of shows that he's having a grand party. Yeah, it's really interesting to see these prices and the prices of prostitutes throughout the city. If we can trust them as real advertisements, those prices often put the price of a certain sexual act at basically the level of a glass of wine, which is horrifying and fascinating all at once.
Mm. Thanks for the comment, Sky. Yeah, there is, Matt, as you describe it that way, there is this sort of fascination of looking at the looking through the looking glass here, but it really does also reveal sort of that that dangerous side of human life as well.
Sure. And I think that's when we show it to our students, that's a fascinating beginning of a conversation, right?
Sort of that gritty reality, which may in fact be a nice segue into the third and the last section,
Sure.
the one that you've titled Sex. And it's funny when we added this, it's important I think for teachers to understand also how to address somewhat tricky topics. And I heard you say at the beginning of the webinar how we can't ignore it, we can't turn our face from it. It is a part of daily life. But just briefly, can you describe how you approach this with your own collegiate level student, but also the ways that you've heard pre-collegiate teachers like the NEH seminar you ran also have addressed this kind of topic?
Sure. Yeah. No, I think you bring up an excellent point. With college students, I certainly don't have to worry too much about the fact that I'll be discussing sexual material. But I do, as we'll see a little bit further on, there's an element of the way that the Romans talk about sex and physical passion. There's a way in which that is certainly representative of rape culture. And I think you have to approach that openly and directly, but also kind of, with sympathy for people's sort of current concerns and current worries. But I think this material, in a way, can allow people to talk about some of these issues in a way that's less heated, because we're talking about ancient evidence, and we can kind of not remove ourselves from it, but we can be somewhat more objective about it. I will say that, yeah, when I've talked with teachers at the pre-collegiate level, sometimes teachers are able to include this kind of material in their teaching, often they're not. And they often have to think very carefully about how they are going to discuss an incident, for example, in Ovid that borders on rape or would now be viewed as rape, how they're going to be able to present that to their students if that's somehow part of the reading that otherwise they have to do. And so when I've done it, just done discussions with teachers, they have found it helpful, at least in terms of their own thought process, to kind of think ahead before they run into this material. And frankly, what I often do is just get out of the way and let them talk to each other, because they have better ideas between each other about how to kind of broach some of these subjects. Yeah, I see Ginger saying high schoolers can handle it, middle schoolers when they have to edit a bit, and I've certainly heard that from students, or from teachers that I've worked with.
Great, thank you, Matt.
Yeah.
So in that case, take us into the red light district here. Tell us about the sex in Roman daily life.
Sure. Well, so Catullus is actually often one of the authors that certainly high school Latin teachers will read. It's very hard to read any Catullus without reading his some of his poems about physical passion. And one of the interesting things is to show students, certainly I found this even at the collegiate level, is to show them the way in which he will express kind of a fervent passion both for male lovers and for female lovers. So we see these two examples here in poem 48 and poem 51, where he's talking about Juventius, and how much he desperately wishes to kiss him, and give him so many kisses, but then also kind of talks in similar terms about how starstruck, how sort of overwhelmed he is when he sees Lesbia, how much passion he has for her. That, for me at least, when I'm teaching, that often then one of the interesting things in the past has been to talk about the way in which, for the Romans, they didn't really think in terms of the gender of your sexual partner. Rather, they thought about the sexual roles that you played with a sexual partner. So they didn't often critique people for the gender of their partner, but they did have many strong views about kind of what role you should play. What's interesting here is we've moved to this famous Warren Cup, which shows has two scenes between a man and a younger boy on the right, and a man and kind of a teenager or maybe even a young man on the left. And I don't know if you can see it, but just at the edge of this, there's a little bit of voyeurism as well. This figure has kind of opened the door and is looking at them. So this is certainly something that I would show my own students in order to get them to see the way in which sort of Roman ideas, certainly about what we call homosexuality. I don't think the Romans didn't really have a term for it. The way that they were sort of more open and accepting in some ways than sort of traditional Western culture.
And did they have taboo around age difference?
That's interesting. They tended, yeah, it was interesting. They tended to feel that that when the younger man sometimes would be a slave, or quite frequently probably would have been a slave, that when he was old enough to start sprouting a beard, that was even though he was a slave and the possession of his owner, and so theoretically his owner could do with him what he wished, that was the age at which the older man should stop showing sexual attention to the younger man. But that may have been the ideal, and it may have been violated. It's really hard. This is the one subject of the three subjects that we've talked about today, that where we don't really have a strong ideas about what people actually did or what they actually felt about it. There's just so much sort of baggage, so much ideology that comes with sexual practice that quite often it's really hard for us to see what's truly going on. But at least we know that certainly a man having sex with either female or a younger female or a younger male, that was not a problem from sort of Roman elite male views.
Great, thank you.
Here is this Ovid poem, and I won't take you through it at all, but you can see that there's a way in which, as he writes this poem, his lover Corinna here seems reluctant, or seems to be saying no, and of course he kind of turns that no into a yes. Her reluctance is basically something that he will ignore, and you know, it's important to really consider this carefully when you look at it with students. I feel. What did the people who were not part of the patriarchy, what did they actually feel about all of this? So what did women and slaves feel? And unfortunately, we have so little evidence. We can't really ever get behind kind of our Roman male elite sources. Once in a great while we can. And so I give you this graffito from Pompeii, where if I gave it to you in Latin, you'd see that the I in this graffito is actually modified by a feminine adjective. And so the love that she's talking about for a girl, for another woman here, this is, one of the few moments when we think what we're looking at, we think we're hearing a woman's point of view about her relationship with another woman. And it's interesting. It feels to us a little bit like Catullus back from those earlier poems. So I don't know exactly what to make of that, but that's interesting. In the Petronius, you see that Trimalchio himself is what's called a freedman. In other words, he once was a slave and eventually got his freedom, and then made a great success of himself, such that he had a lot of money and he had slaves of his own. And what you see him talking about in this source is the fact that at the beginning of this scene, he's actually showing lots of sort of physical attention to a slave boy of his, and his wife gets really upset and yells at him. So the sexual dynamics in a Roman familia must have been intense, because the Roman master, the patriarch, could basically do what he wanted, certainly with his slaves. But that doesn't mean that his wife had to like it. And so Fortunata, Trimalchio's wife, really gets angry at him here. But then he turns around and says, basically, that he himself, as a slave, one of the reasons why he ultimately became successful as a young man is because he was the object of the sexual attention of his own master. And so this is a satire written by kind of an elite freeborn man, Petronius. But I like to think that actually he's kind of captured some of the paradox, certainly the paradox in a Roman freedman's life, which was that probably as a slave, quite possibly as a slave, he was sexually used by his own master, but eventually he got his freedom, got some property, got some power of his own, had slaves of his own, and then what was the relationship like that he had with his own slaves? It's very complex. I always say to my students that the one thing that would have been so different and so strange and alien to us about the Roman world and about Roman daily life would have been living in a slave society. Forget the technology. It would have been the idea that one human being can own another is mind bending, and I think that would have been true on a daily basis. Okay. So one of the things certainly is true. I think one of the questions that I had posed was kind of how aggressive and male dominated is Roman sexuality, and probably almost all of you could have answered very, even before looking at my source material. And one of the ways that certainly shows up is how many sort of pictures that we have, especially of this character, this figure known as Priapus. And so this is a painting. It's fascinating. This painting of the god Priapus, who's sort of a phallic god. This comes from the entrance to a house, the house of the Vetii. And you can see that his phallus there, his erect phallus, is weighed on one side of a scale, and on the other side is a bag. You can just see it at the edge of the picture. The other side is a bag, probably a bag of money. And so in some ways, Priapus here, both in the poem but also in the painting, is a very sort of open acknowledgement of sort of male power, male strength, fertility. You can see all the fruits and vegetables down below there. But also sort of aggression and defense of the home. I mean, I think it's not accidental that this painting appears right at the entrance to the house, in some ways as kind of a sign of the success within it, but also of the sort of protective nature of Priapus, maybe. Yeah. So I just seen Kayla's comment here, where she says, "I'm sure that discussions of sexuality were not as taboo among young students." I think you're probably talking about. Are you talking about ancient times or modern times?
Ancient times, yeah.
And yeah, no, I think one thing to take away from any discussion of Roman sexuality is that they were much more open to it, or much more sort of unsurprised by it. I mean, just the nudity in the baths alone perhaps suggests that. But they did not really have a Puritan streak in some ways. Just to kind of show you another amazing painting. This comes from a bath known as the Suburban Baths in Pompeii. And it's this incredible set of eight paintings showing 8 different sexual scenes. The 2 scenes here on the left and in the center are both scenes of oral sex. You see a man performing cunnilingus on a woman and a woman performing fellatio on a man. These paintings appeared in the changing room of the bath, up above where there would have been a shelf where you left your clothes. And the best scholarly interpretation of this is that you remembered where you left your clothes by the sexual act above the shelf where you had placed them. But they, but yeah, this is the archaeologists who discovered this were much more shocked and amazed than I think any of the ancient Romans would have been, ancient Pompeians would have been. I think you're exactly right, Ginger. I think that's exactly right. Now, they were much more open about sexuality and sex, again, from at least from the sources that we have, from an elite male Roman point of view, freeborn point of view. Coming pretty much to the close of my webinar here, and I just have a couple more sources to show and talk a little bit about. Again, we see Marshall. And we see Marshall talking about sex, again, in terms of social hierarchy and social performance. And his concern always is to basically point to someone who's lower down on the social ladder than he is. The graffiti from Pompeii, quite often that mentions sex, and here you can see lots of references, especially to oral sex. Anyone who participated in or who used their mouth in oral sex was looked down upon by the Romans. So quite often, what we see in our source material are kind of invective attacks against various people, often named, and accusing them of doing some sort of despised sexual act from the Roman point of view. The last little bit I wanted to show you is another incredible source. And again, some of you who've been to Pompeii might have actually seen this. This is the brothel in Pompeii. The brothel is, this building is as far as I know, is the only purpose-built brothel in the whole of the Roman world that we know. In other words, the only building that was seems to have been, from its foundations, constructed in such a fashion as to serve as a brothel. One of the amazing things about this space is that in the first 2 rooms off of the entryway 18 here, in room F and in room D, we have probably the most graffiti per square foot, the most graffiti anywhere in the Roman world. We have a total of about 125 graffiti in this brothel. And that's fascinating when you actually look at what is written here. Here are some of the paintings that we find within the brothel, sort of generic sexual acts, such as this woman atop that man. But then we get kind of a colder dose of reality. You can see that bed is actually made out of masonry. There are bricks and cement that make that up. That's not a comfy pillow there. You would have had to have some kind of covers or pillows or blankets to make that at all feasible. But these are part of each room. There's a bed in here. And then what's so fascinating is that there are graffiti on the walls. And I gave you just a selection of them. Here I screwed many girls. What's interesting is that we have several of them that seem to present themselves as the woman writing, as in other words, as the prostitute writing. And I'm pretty much agree with scholars who have come to the conclusion that these are authentic. In other words, that these were actually written by women, the women who worked here, some of these, and they're not somebody kind of faking their graffito. And we never would have guessed that, for example, a Roman prostitute would be interested in writing or would have done that kind of writing. This is, a colder, harder sort of Roman world. So this is not certainly the physical passion that we saw back with Catullus. This is a pretty grim existence, and you get the feeling for this, how little light, how little air is in there, how hard these beds would have been, how they probably would have worked there all day long, and then perhaps had rooms upstairs at the nighttime, or they would have worked through the night. It would have been a pretty grim existence, and that is certainly sort of a sobering thing to bring to students' attention if you're only reading Catullus, or you're only reading perhaps some of the lighter moments of Ovid.
Mm. What was the literacy rate at the time?
Fantastic question. I would argue that it's the sliding scale. In other words, there were fairly low percentage, 5 or 7 or 10%, who could actually read Virgil, but there was a higher percentage who could read, for example, hello inscribed on a wall. So maybe 15 or 20% or 25 or 30%. Our studies of graffiti seem to show people fairly low down on the social scale being interested in interacting by using writing. And so it's perhaps higher than we first estimated.
Got it. Thank you. We're just about out of time, Matt. I wonder if there are any last questions for Matt on this topic of sexuality in Roman daily life. I've seen Sky again. I appreciate you handling some, almost as a TA, handling some of the questions as they've come through. What last questions do you have our participants on the topic of sexuality? Yeah, it strikes me, Matt, that that even if this topic is difficult for different age groups or different environments to teach, as an educated professional, it only enhances our teachers' understanding of this complexity of Roman life. Yes. So even if they're not displaying some of these images or some of this vocabulary, it actually is really important to understand this bigger picture, and that includes the layers of opulence and grimness.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly.
Well, we've come to the end, Matt. I've got one last question for you to wrap up tonight's webinar. It's been just a fantastic look at Roman daily life through these three primary lenses. But my question for you is a little bit more open-ended, and maybe it's a place to leave all of our participants, certainly whether they teach this content directly or not, and that is, in your opinion, what does this understanding of Roman daily life, or Rome, or the classics in general, how does it help us understand the world we live in today in 2019?
Well, I think it gives us perspective. Actually, there's a way in which I think it can make us feel more hopeful about the place that we're currently in. In other words, no one would really want to go back and live in Roman times. The injustice of it shows perhaps how far we've come. Not that we want to stop there or stop improving or becoming more just. But I think it gives us some perspective in that way. I think it also might, if we really thought hard about how important some of these core elements of daily life, I mean, especially in terms of food security, or things in terms of fresh water and health, that these are kind of the bedrock elements of what human society needs to sort of thrive and be happy and be successful. And I think one of the reasons why the Romans were fairly successful, and didn't actually have people rebelling against them all the time, at least one element of that was that they provided a fairly high level of sort of basic material needs. And that's really interesting to think about, and to think about how we should be doing that for people even now.
That's a great way to end it. Matt, I really want to offer my thanks from all of our participants for your guidance tonight. We hope to see you again in future webinars and activities at the center, but I also want to encourage, with your permission, for teachers to reach out to you if they have additional questions.
Okay, thank you. I'd welcome that. Thanks.
And I want to thank all of our participants tonight for joining us at tonight's session. Please follow the National Humanities Center on social media to see updates on upcoming events and opportunities. This does include the upcoming Teachers Advisory Council application process. It also includes new webinars that we're offering in pretty regular times. You can take a look at our Facebook page. You can follow us on Twitter. And you can also use that YouTube channel to see recordings of previous webinars, and again, slow them down and really linger with the material. Perhaps even let your students view some of that material with the associated sources. When the room closes tonight, you'll be invited to complete an evaluation, and once that's completed, you can download your certificate of attendance, and that then goes into your teaching portfolio, and you can get credit for spending the evening with us. I hope to see all of you next time, March 26th, when the webinar is titled Science Fiction and Contemporary American Culture. We'll be working with Kate Marshall, who is an associate professor of English at University of Notre Dame. Kate's also a former fellow at the center, and I'm very pleased to welcome her back to this series and give us an opportunity to better understand the role of science fiction as it helps us understand the world that we live in. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. We always appreciate your contributions, and we hope to see you again at the next Humanities in Class webinar at the National Humanities Center. Good night. Have a great day at school tomorrow.